Tonight, we're going to cover FCC regulations, one of the most thrilling parts of getting a ham radio license, if anybody is used to dealing with regulations. And as usual, we have the same people who are sponsoring this class that have sponsored all the rest of them. So we'll start out with Section 1, which is FCC Rules and Regulations. On the test, there are 67 questions in the question pool on Federal Communications Rules and Regulations, which actually has 6 questions on the test on this topic, which is more than any other section on the entire test. Some of the other sections have 4, some have 2. The rules and regulations have 6. Knowing the FCC rules and regulations is very important. The violation of the rules and regulations can result in the loss of your amateur radio license. So you want to make sure that you don't violate any of these rules and regulations. Who makes the rules and why should you follow them? The United States amateur radio is governed by the Federal Communications Commission, or simply the FCC. 47 Federal Code of Regulations, Part 97, are all the rules on amateur radio. While the office overseeing amateur radio is located in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, most of your business with the FCC will be conducted over the internet at www.fcc.government. You must make your station records available when requested by the FCC. If you don't follow the FCC rules, they can revoke your license, fine you, and even seize your radio equipment. Fortunately, that does not happen very often. Talking again about being fined or having someone lose their radio equipment, that normally only happens if people intentionally cause interference on the radio. As an example, they had a person in New York who was intentionally interfering with the New York Police Department communication system. They caught him, revoked his license, hit him with a $400,000 fine, and seized all of his radio equipment. So unless you do something about that bad, you normally don't have to worry about the FCC coming after you. So, which agency regulates and enforces the rules for amateur radio service in the United States? Options are FEMA, Homeland Security, the FCC, and all of these choices are correct. Remember, it's the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. When must the station licensee make the station and its records available for FCC inspection? Anytime 10 days after notification by the FCC, anytime upon request by an FCC representative, only after failing to comply with an FCC notice of violation, or only when presented with a valid warrant by an FCC official or government agent. Remember, anytime that you get a request from an FCC representative, you have to show them your station records. What, if any, other restrictions concerning transmission of a language that may be considered indecent or obscene? Any such language is prohibited. They don't maintain a list. The ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union, doesn't maintain a list, but there is a prohibition on using obscene or vile language. How does the FCC define broadcasting for amateur radio services? We are not permitted to broadcast. And a broadcast is a transmission intended for reception by the general public. So you cannot send out a transmission intended for reception by the general public. It has to be a two-way transmission between radio operators. Under which of the following circumstances are one-way transmissions by amateur radios prohibited? And there again, that is broadcasting. You cannot broadcast a transmission that is meant for the general public. When may amateur radio operators use their station to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? Never, when the equipment is not the personal property of either the station licensee or the control operator or close relatives, when no profit is made on the sale, or when selling amateur radio equipment and not on a regular basis. The answer is when selling amateur radio equipment and not on a regular basis. Now, we actually do have what's called a swap net. Every Thursday night, 7 o'clock, we come on the radio on the countywide system and we discuss people who have equipment for sale or people who are looking for equipment. Because we are not a commercial entity, we can have a net like that. If I was from DX Engineering or from some other place that sells radio equipment professionally, I could not do that. But if I have a radio that I want to sell, I'm allowed to actually let people know that I have that piece of equipment that's for sale. Why does amateur radio exist? Amateur radio doesn't exist just because it's a fun hobby. The government allows amateur operations because of the benefits it can provide society, such as advancing skills in the technical and communications phases of the radio art, improving international goodwill, providing means of emergency communications in the event of a natural disaster, and encouraging people to develop skills based on personal interest with no business or commercial use and no financial compensation. There is one exception to financial compensation. If a person happens to be a school teacher who is paid by a school district and they have a class in their classroom where they teach people about ham radio communications, they are permitted to be compensated by the school district because they're a full-time instructor. We actually have one person here who's now a principal, but he does still teach, and he has a ham radio in his class, and he has taught his students about ham radio operations. He is permitted to be paid while he does that because he is a professional school teacher. So, why does amateur radio exist? Which of the following is part of the basis and purpose of amateur radio service? And it's advancing the skills and technical communications phases of the radio art. The reason they say the technical skills is a number of ham radio operators actually build a lot of their equipment, and they actually have designed equipment that hasn't been used before. So they are advancing technical skills in communications. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator in an amateur station receive compensation for operating the station? When the communication is incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. That is the only time. If I'm doing anything on the radio, I can't request compensation for it unless I am a school teacher at an educational institution. Radio licenses. The FCC currently issues only 3 classes of amateur radio license. These are the technician, which is the one that you are going for, a general, and an amateur extra. A written exam is required for each license, and a person may hold only one operator primary station license at a time. The FCC has eliminated the requirement for Morse code proficiency for all amateur class licenses. For a long time, the FCC required people to have a proficiency in Morse code for each one of the levels, and each level actually increased. You had to do like 5 words a minute for a technician, 12 for general, and more for amateur extra. Technician class privileges are limited to the relatively short range VHF and UHF bands, where there's plenty of opportunity for exciting communication. Most of the communications you'll find in the county are done on the VHF and UHF bands. The technician class licensees do have a limited shortwave or HF privilege, although most are restricted to the CW, which is the Morse code sections of the bands. So, for which license classes are new licensees currently available from the FCC? Remember, it's three of them: technician, general, and amateur extra. How many operator primary station license grants may be held by one person? A person can only have one primary operator or station license. Now, there is one thing where a person could have two licenses, but it's not a primary or operator station license. We have people in the county who actually have a license for a club or for like the Office of Emergency Services, because every license grant has to be owned by someone. So we have someone who has a operator primary license, station license, but he also has a license for the Office of Emergency Services. And each one of those is a separate call sign. An FCC amateur license is required before one can control the transmissions from an amateur radio station. The license and authority to transmit is granted as soon as it's added to the FCC Universal Licensing System database. That means you don't have to wait for the license to show up in the email to get it on the air. Unlicensed persons can talk over the radio as long as a licensed amateur is present as the control operator for the station. So, if I have a license and my wife doesn't, she can talk on the radio as a third person, but I have to be right here so I can turn the radio off in case she does something wrong. There's no license required to listen on amateur communications. If you want to look at the Universal License System database, that's the email or the internet address on the bottom of the screen. What proves that the FCC has issued an operator primary license grant? The license appears in the FCC Universal License System database. So you can actually go on and check, although from what I understand now that they're doing it electronically, they're being issued very quickly. I know I had to wait about 10 days for mine, and I have heard of people that had to wait about 3 weeks when they were doing the old hand additions to the database. How soon after passing the exam for your first amateur radio license may you transmit on the radio band? As soon as the operator station license grant appears in the FCC license database. You have to wait until it does, but as soon as it does, you can start talking on the radio. Your license is valid for 10 years and is renewable without any further exam required. The only time you have to take further examinations if you want to advance from a technician to a general or a general to an amateur extra. Renewal can be completed by mailing a completed copy of the FCC Form 605, along with a copy of your license, to the FCC office in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. All license modifications and renewals may also be processed on the FCC website. During the term of the license, you have to notify the FCC of any change of address or email address. This is extremely important. If the FCC attempts to contact you by mail or email, and the correspondence is returned as undeliverable, the FCC may revoke the station license and suspend your operator license. As soon as they revoke or suspend you, if you talk on the radio, you're in violation of federal law. So what's the normal term for an FCC amateur radio license? 10 years. What may happen if the FCC is unable to reach you by mail? They can revoke the station license or suspend the operator license. If it's revoked, then you will probably have to re-exam for it. If it's suspended, you can probably get away with the 2-year leeway that they give for renewing your license. Which of the following can result in revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator license? Failure to maintain and provide a correct email address with the FCC. So if you move or if you change your email, you have to let them know. License renewals are accepted only during the last 90 days of the license term. If you forget to renew your license before the expiration date, you have a 2-year grace period to renew without taking an exam. So if you happen to be working on the radio and all of a sudden one day you look at your license and go, whoops, it's expired. At that point, you can no longer talk on the radio, but you have up to 2 years to request a renewal without taking an exam. What's the grace period for renewal if an amateur license expires? 2 years. If your license has expired and is still within the allowable grace period, may you continue to operate a transmitter on amateur radio frequencies? No. You have to wait until the license has been renewed. And you'll know it's been renewed by watching the license database, and you'll see on the database it will say that it's been reactivated. They have a couple of different categories on there. Primarily it's active and suspended or expired. So when you look at the database, if it doesn't say active on it, you cannot transmit. Radio call signs. The FCC issues each amateur station a unique call sign, which is used to identify the station during operation. While the specifics can vary a bit, all U.S. call signs follow the same basic format. Each U.S. call sign begins with 1 or 2 letters, with the first letter being either A, K, N, or W. This is followed by a single number, 0 to 9, which indicates a graphic region of the state where the license was issued. All amateur call signs issued in California contain the number 6, with other numbers designating other parts of the country. California is actually unique. We are the only state that has a single number. Almost all of the other numbers are multiple states. The call will then have 1 to 3 letters following the single number. A 1-by-1 call sign, single letter, number, single letter, may be issued by the FCC when requesting for a special events station. This is very rare. It's not done very often. So here's some examples of call signs. W6MMM. That's a 1-by-3. WB9NJS. That's a 2-by-3. N7L, 1-by-1, special events call sign. K5GTW, another 1-by-3. W1AW, a 1-by-2. AA4 Tango, a 2-by-1. The FCC issues call signs consecutively, with most new California call signs currently starting with the prefix AN6. And it's typical for everyone who passes the exam in the same session to have call signs that differ by only the last letter, such as KN6ABC, then KN6ABD, then KN680F or ABF. So they'll all be consecutively numbered. After you receive your call sign, you can request a special or vanity call sign from the FCC. As a technician class license, you may request a 1-by-3 or a 2-by-3 vanity call sign. My call sign is a vanity call sign, KA6EOC. I was originally KN6RPT, but I didn't like that call sign, so I requested one because my initials actually are MGM, and it's a lot easier to remember. So which of the following is a valid technician call sign format? KF1 XXX, that's a 2 by 3. The KA1X would be a 2 by 1, can't have that. W1XX would be a 1 by 2, you can't have that. It will be either a single letter, number, and 3 letters, or 2 letters, a number, and 3 letters. Which of the following formats of a self-assigned indicators is acceptable when identifying a phone use transmission? If you look at these, you'll see a KL7CC stroke 3, a KL7CC slant 3, a KLCC/W3. All of the choices are correct. Now, what does this mean? KL7 is a call sign for Alaska only. If you're operating in Maryland, which happens to be a 3, you add the W3 to indicate you're working outside of your home location. The reason you do that is you don't want hams in Maryland thinking they're reaching Alaska on 2 meters. You'll have a lot of ham radio operators passing out thinking that they can get all the way from Maryland into Alaska on their little handheld radio. So, if you're going to be using your radio outside of your assigned number district, which if you're in California, number 6 is anywhere, you can use one of these to indicate that you are operating outside of California. So all of the choices are correct. Who may select a desired call sign under the vanity call sign rules? Anyone can. But you also have to be careful when you're selecting it because you're going to fill out a form to send to the FCC with the call sign you want. A number of call signs are restricted. They are not issuing any A or N call signs. Those have all been issued in the past. And there's a lot of other call signs, such as a call sign that begins or ends with WX. WX are reserved for the National Weather Service. There are a number of other call signs that are reserved for other reasons. The best thing to do is to go on the FCC website and plug in the call sign that you may want to have. I thought, gee, I'll be really neat with my call sign and I'll have M1KE, Mike. Well, no, I won't because I'm not allowed to have an M. So you have to look at a number of things if you're going to request a vanity call sign before you actually go ahead and submit the paperwork to make sure the call signs you're submitting are permitted. Which of the following is a requirement for the issuance of a club station license grant? If you want to form your own club, such as we have WARS, the Willits Amateur Radio Society, you have to have at least 4 members in the club in order to request a club call sign. It doesn't have to be an amateur extra. You can have a technician request one. The club doesn't have to be registered with the American Radio Relay League, but you have to have at least 4 members to request a club call sign. Frequency coordination. The person who recommends and transmit and receive frequencies for auxiliary and repeater stations is called a frequency coordinator. The frequency coordinator is selected by amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be auxiliary or repeater stations. In California, Northern California, we rely on the Northern Amateur Radio Relay Council of California, or NARRC. So if you want to actually have a repeater station, we have a number of them throughout the county. All of those have to be coordinated through the NARC so that we don't have conflicts between the repeaters. You want to set one up, you pick out a frequency, you coordinate with the NARC. If someone else is using that frequency, you're going to have to go on to another frequency. That way we don't end up with a bunch of conflict of everybody interfering with everybody else's repeater. So which of the following entities recommends transmit receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? It's done by the frequency coordinator. Who selects a frequency coordinator? The amateur operators in a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be auxiliary or repeater stations. Like I said, for Northern California, and I'm talking from the Oregon border all the way down to about San Francisco, it's all done through the NARC. What frequencies can you use? Each class of license has different operating frequencies available to it, with increasing privileges going from technician to general to amateur extra class. It's very important that you know what frequencies you're permitted to transmit on if you are to avoid problems with the FCC. The frequency segments or bands are typically referred to by the approximate wavelength of the radio wave, the 40-meter band, the 10-meter band, the 2-meter band, etc. That is the distance in meters that the radio wave travels during the time it takes to complete one full cycle. Frequency is measured in hertz, cycles per second, with radio frequencies usually in kilohertz, megahertz, and even gigahertz. To find the wavelength in meters, simply divide 300 by the frequency in megahertz. For example, 50 megahertz, one wavelength, equals 30 divided by 50, so that's the 6-meter frequency. The exam will have some questions regarding frequency privileges, so remember the following information. Now, you don't have to memorize this list, but if you look on the left side or the right side of the list, you'll see it talks about 2 meters and 70 centimeters. There are questions on the test that regard the 2-meter band and the 70 centimeter band. If you look here, what is in yellow is what you are permitted to operate on. So on 2 meters, which is 144 to 148 megahertz, you can only operate CW or Morse code on 1.44 or 144.0 to 144.1. And then you can use phone or voice on 144.1 to 148.0. On 70 centimeters, which is 420 to 450, all modes are available, including CW, voice, image, and data. If you look at the other bands, you can go to 10 meters, and on 10 meters, you are permitted to use single sideband phone from 28.3 to 28.5 with a maximum of 200 watts power. If you look at the general license for that category, the general license is permitted to operate on 28.3 all the way up to 28.7. So there is an increase in the general, and the amateur extra has a little increase over that. So as you go up in your license categories, you're permitted to operate on more frequencies. If you're a general license, you can operate on all of these frequencies. So which frequency is within the 6-meter band? It's B, 52.525. Remember, 300 divided by 300 divided by 50 is 6. How many amateurs use the 219 to 220 megahertz segment of the 1.25 meter band? Fixed digital message forwarding systems only. So that's only for digital messaging. On which HF bands does the technician class operator have phone privileges? 10 meters only. So remember, 10 meters you can use for phone privileges No other ones. Well, other than the 2 and the 70 centimeter. Which of the following frequency ranges are available for phone operation by a technician license? Here again, it goes to the 10-meter band, 28.3 to 28.5 megahertz. Which of the following UHF, VHF band segments are limited to CW only? 50.0 megahertz to 50.1 megahertz, and 144.0 megahertz to 141 megahertz. And that applies to everyone. Where may single sideband phone be used in amateur bands above 50 megahertz? At least in some segments of all the bands. And which amateur band includes 146.520, that's the 2-meter band, and 146.520 is what's known as the national calling frequency. If you happen to be traveling somewhere and you're outside the range of what the normal frequencies are that you would use in your county or your state, and you put it on 146.520, you happen to have a ham antenna sticking up off the top of your car, or a ham license plate, and someone else sees you who's a ham, they will switch to 146.520 and give you a call. And then if you're listening to 146.520, you can respond, and they'll probably recommend a frequency that you switch over to, and the two of you can have a conversation. Works really good talking to other amateurs from other locations. Why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of the amateur band or subband? To allow for calibration error in the transmitter frequency display, so that modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the edge of the band, and to allow for transmitter frequency drift. These are all correct answers. You don't want to be right on the edge of the amateur band because you can get some bleed over into other bands. You don't want to bleed over into other bands. Power usage. The term watt has been referred to several times. Watts are the unit of measure of power, and we'll talk more about this later. Transmitter power is usually expressed as peak envelope power, or PEP, PEP. This is defined as the average power supplied to the antenna transmission line during one RF cycle at the crest of the modulation cycle. Except for the 200 watt limitations for technician HF operation, radio controlled models, and beacon stations, the maximum allowable amateur power is 1500 watts PEP. Most of the radios that you're going to go out and buy, if it's a handheld, it's going to have about 5 watts max PEP. If it's a mobile, it will probably have 50 watts PEP. But you can buy amplifiers, and you can actually increase that power up to 1500 watts if you want to. If you want to use 1500 watts, you're going to blow every other station near you off of the air. So I would not recommend it. There is a caveat to this, however, that amateurs are required to use only the power required to maintain communications. So, don't use 500 watts when 5 watts will do. If you can get into someone with 5 watts, use 5 watts. If you can't, kick it up to 20. If you can't get them with 20, kick it up to 50. If you can't get them with 50 and you haven't got any more than that, you're not going to talk to them. But try and use as little power as possible to maintain communications so that you don't broadcast a lot further than you want to and interfere with other people. What's a maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using their assigned portion of the HF band? The maximum you can use is 200 watts. Except for some specific restrictions, what's the maximum peak envelope output power for technician class operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz? The maximum is 1500 watts. I can tell you right now, I've got radios that go up to 100 watts. And on 100 watts, I can talk into, this is on HF, I can talk into Montana, I can talk into Mexico. I know somebody who's in on this class right now who is sitting in the park in Willits and talking to Croatia one night. So on the HF band, you can get quite a lot with just 100 watts. And there's very few places in the county you can't get with 50 watts on the UHF, VHF using our repeater system. International agreements. The FCC, in conjunction with international agreements, establishes the amateur bands and specifies some limitations on modes which can be used. By international agreement, the world is divided into 3 international telecommunication union regions by the United Nations. North and South America, including all of the continental U.S., is included in ITU 2. You are authorized to operate your amateur station in a foreign country when the foreign country authorizes it. You can check, and there will be a list of countries where you cannot transmit, such as North Korea. FCC licensed amateurs are prohibited from exchanging communications with any country whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union that it objects to such communications. You may operate from any vessel or aircraft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. Yes, you can, but I would check with the captain before you operate your ham radio on board his ship. He may have some restrictions or reasons that he doesn't want it to occur. International Morse Code, or CW, can be used anywhere on any band, with some band segments set aside for CW only. We talked about that earlier. On many of the VHF and UHF bands, the use of band segments or the band plan is determined by the amateurs in a gentleman's agreement. So from which of the following locations may an FCC licensed amateur station transmit? From any vessel or aircraft located in international waters and documented or registered in the U.S. Like I said, check with the captain before you operate your radio. Which of the countries are FCC licensed amateurs prohibited from exchanging communications? Any countries whose administration has notified the International Telecommunications Union that it objects to such communication. There's a section in the Gordon West book that you can look at, and it has a current list of all of the countries that are restricted, and it has a list of the countries that are approved. So you can look at that list and determine whether or not you can talk to them. What types of international communications is an FCC licensed operator radio station permitted to make? Communications incidental to the purpose of amateur radio service and remarks of a personal character. You cannot conduct business or any communications that would not be permitted, that would be considered an international broadcast. Station control operators. The FCC requires that a licensed radio operator be in control of the emissions from each amateur radio station. A station is never allowed to transmit without a control operator. The control operator may be you, the station licensee, or any licensed amateur chosen by the station licensee. Both the control operator and the station licensee are responsible for proper operation of an amateur station in accordance with FCC rules. The control operator function is performed from the control point of an amateur radio station. This may be directly in front of the radio in use or via a remote control link. What does all of this mean? Whenever you have an amateur radio that is in operation, there has to be a licensed radio operator using it. So let's say that I'm over at Tim's house and Tim's letting me use his radio. Tim is actually the station licensee, but I would be the control operator. We both have to be licensed. If I do something wrong, we can both get in trouble. So that's why it's really good to be there when your radio is being operated. The transmitting privileges of an amateur station depend on the class of the operator license held by the control operator. The operating privilege of the stations follow the control operator. For example, if you allow an extra class licensee to be the control operator of your technician station, he may use any of the frequencies available to an extra license class. On the other hand, if you visit the station of an extra license class, you are the control operator of that station. You may only use your technician privileges when operating. Here again, an example. I have a general license. Tim has an amateur extra. Tim can use my radio on the amateur extra bands. I can't. If I'm at his station, I can't use his amateur extra bands there either because I'm a general operator. So you have to look at the class of your license privilege to know what frequencies you can and can't use. What determines the transmitting privileges of an amateur station? The license class of the operator held by the control operator. What is an amateur station control point? The location at which the control operator function is being performed. When is an amateur station permitted to transmit without a control operator? It's never permitted to operate without a control operator. The control operator is there to make sure that the FCC rules and regulations are not violated. And who must designate the station control operator? The station licensee. So the station licensee can have somebody else function as the control operator. When the control operator is not the station's licensee, who's responsible for the proper operation of the station? Both the control operator and the station licensee are equally responsible. One of the best examples of this is what's known as the MARS, the military affiliated radio stations. We have military affiliated radio stations. When I was in Vietnam, we had one. And what they would do is the operator there would patch in phone calls through to the US. Then people could actually call from his radio through a radio in the US that was patched into a phone call to whoever they wanted to talk to. The person who was there was the control operator, and they had to make sure that the conversation that was being held between the two people who were talking didn't violate the FCC rules. If they did, he immediately turned off the radio station. They're the control operator. They could also be the station licensee, and they're equally responsible for making sure that the FCC rules and regulations are followed. Who does the FCC presume to be the control operator of an amateur radio station unless documentation is contrary in the station records? The station licensee. So that's why you keep the records of who is operating your station at what time. So that if something happens, you can point out that, yes, I'm the station licensee, but here's the person who was actually on the radio at the time as a control operator. Under normal circumstances, may a technician class licensee be the control operator of the station, operating exclusively amateur extra class segments of the amateur bands at no time. If you're a technician, even if you're at an amateur extras radio station, you cannot operate on the amateur extra bands, only on the bands you're authorized to. Which of the following is an example of an automatic control? A repeater operation. Repeaters, I transmit over my radio. It goes into the repeater. It's repeated from there and basically broadcast to other repeaters on other ham radios. So that is under automatic control. Which of the following is an example of remote control as defined by Part 37? Operating the station over the internet. We have some repeaters that can be set up so that I transmit from here, it goes to the repeater, from the repeater it goes into the internet, and then from the internet it goes into other repeaters in other locations. And that is broadcast from those repeaters to other ham radios. What type of amateur station simultaneously retransmits the signal of another amateur station on a different channel or channels? And that's a repeater station. I talk into it on one frequency. It takes the frequency I'm talking into it on, and then it puts it out on another frequency that you can receive. And that's all done automatically. Who is accountable should the repeater inadvertently retransmit communications that violate the FCC rules? The control operator of the originating station. So if I have a repeater and it's set up and somebody violates the FCC rules, I, as the repeater operator, do not get in trouble. The control operator at the originating station is the person who would get in trouble. And what types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit the signals of other amateur stations? Repeaters, auxiliaries, or space stations. And they do have ham satellites that are sent up where you can actually send a signal from your radio through the satellite to another radio. Which of the following is true of remote control operations? The operator must be at the control point. Control operator must be at the control point. A control operator is required at all times. The control operator indirectly manipulates the controls. All of those choices are correct. You have to have a control operator at the control point. They're required at all times, and they can indirectly manipulate the controls. Station identification. The FCC requires you to identify the transmissions from your station by transmitting your call sign at least every 10 minutes and at the end of a contact. There is no requirement to identify your station at the start of a contact. Regardless of the language used to make the contact, identification must be made in English. An identification ID is usually done in the mode being used, but can always be done using CW or Morse code. A number of our repeaters here have an automatic CW transmitter so that when the station is activated, the repeater will automatically send out the call sign of the person who owns the repeater in Morse code. Now, when I call someone, I can pick up the radio and I say, "Hi, Tim, are you here on Countywide?" And if Tim is on there, he can respond that he is. And then, at least every 10 minutes during our conversation, I have to say KC6MGM. At the end of the contact, I also have to say KC6MGM. But there's no requirement to identify your station right at the beginning of a contact. The best thing to do is to call the station by their call sign, because there's more than one Tim, there's more than one Mike, there's more than one Jim. So you want to make sure you get a hold of the right person by calling their call sign. So normally when I would call Tim, I'd be WB9NJS, this is KC6MGM. So he knows that I'm calling him, and he knows that I'm the Mike that's calling him. There's no special designation required for technician HF operations. nor for portable or mobile operations, though it is common for mobile stations to identify as such. So if I'm in my car and I'm driving down the road, I'll go KC6MGM mobile. Now people know that I'm not at my base station, that I'm driving around. The only time a special suffix /KT, /AG, or /AE must be added to a call sign is when using new license privileges earned by a CSCE while waiting for an upgrade to a previously issued license to appear in the FCC license database. This is the one exception that you can have where you can actually transmit on a frequency when you don't have that specific license in the database. So, I am a technician. I just took the general exam. I passed it. I got the piece of paper, the CSCE, that says I am now a general license. I can go on and say KC6MGM/AG, which indicates to people I am now a general license. And then once it's in the database, I can drop using the AG and just see KC6MGM. Because if people look in the database, they'll see that I am a general. When operating in support of special events such as bike races, it's permissible to use a race tactical call sign, such as race headquarters, to identify your transmissions, as long as you include your FCC issued call sign at least every 10 minutes and at the end of your transmission. Now, the at least every 10 minutes. If you talk for 10 minutes straight, then you have to give your call sign. Or you have to give your call sign at the end of your transmission. So if I talk for a minute, I give my call sign. I don't have to give it again every 10 minutes. Only when I'm actually active on the air for 10 minutes do I have to give my call sign again. So if this class was being held on the air, I would have given my call sign at least 7 times by now. Since many letters have similar sounds when spoken, B, D, E, a phonetic alphabet is often used for call sign operation when operating in phone mode. This is particularly helpful during noisy conditions or if one of the operators has limited English speaking ability. The phonetic alphabet uses a different word to represent each letter. Phonetics work best when everybody uses the same words. The internationally recognized phonetic alphabet is encouraged over personal phonetics. So this is the phonetic alphabet we use in ham radio. This is the same one that the military uses, but it's different than what law enforcement uses. If you're working on the ham radio, it is best to use this one instead of using some words that people might not quite recognize. If I say Quebec for Q, everybody who's a ham radio operator is going to recognize that Quebec means Q. If I say November for N, they're going to recognize that November means N. So the best thing to do is use the standard phonetic alphabet, and then everybody recognizes it. The one exception to the 10-minute ID rule is when you use amateur radio to control a model aircraft or vehicle, which is allowed on the 6-meter band. This is a special case. You need only to have your call sign, name, and address affixed to the transmitter. An important restriction for radio control operation is it can only have a maximum operating power of 1 watt. Other exceptions to the ID rule apply to the transmission from space stations or satellites. So, when is an amateur station required to transmit its assigned call sign? At the beginning of each contact and every 10 minutes? No. At least once during each transmission? No. At least every 15 minutes during at the end of communications? No. At least every 10 minutes during and at the end of a communication. Remember, 10 minutes. often must you identify with your FCC call sign? When using tactical call signs such as a race headquarters. Never. Tactical call sign is sufficient. Once during every hour, at the end of each communication, and every 10 minutes during the communications, or at the end of every transmission. At the end of each communication and every 10 minutes. That's the standard. What method of call sign identification is required for stations transmitting phone signals? You can send the call sign using CW or a phone emission. Either one of those is acceptable. Which of the following is an acceptable language for use in station identification when operating on a phone subband? The English language. You'll find out that people from all over the world use English when they're identifying themselves using their call sign. What are the FCC rules regarding the use of a phonetic alphabet for station identification in the amateur radio service? It's encouraged. It's not mandated, but it is encouraged. And we still have a lot of people here who sometimes throw in words that aren't standard, but you can quite often get what they're trying to say. It's encouraged to use the standard phonetic alphabet. When may an amateur station transmit without on-air identification? The only time is when transmitting signals control a model aircraft. Other than that, you have to have some on-air identification. And when you're transmitting the signals control the model aircraft, you have to have your name and call sign on the transmitter that's sending the signal. Third-party station use. In many cases, it's perfectly legal to forward messages from non-amateurs via amateur radio. It's also permissible to allow a non-licensed person to talk over the air on your radio, as long as a licensed amateur is present as a control operator and continuously monitoring the third party's participation. This general rule, however, does not hold when international communications are involved. And that's why I mentioned, if you look at page 42 of the Gordon West Guide, it shows which countries will allow third-party communications. You can't have third-party communications if the country receiving doesn't authorize it. Third-party communication is defined as a message sent between two amateur stations for someone else. And that someone else being the third party. The third party could be a person sending or receiving the message, or both. So I could have my wife here sending a message to someone else's wife who is not a ham radio operator, as long as both of the people who are the control operators are ham radio operators. Before you can allow third-party traffic to pass across the border through your amateur station, you must first make sure that the U.S. has a third-party agreement with the country at the other end, or that the third party is qualified to be a control operator. So the third party could be another ham. Identification procedures change slightly when international third-party messages are passed. In these cases, the U.S. station must give the call sign of both stations at the end of each communication. A list of countries with the third-party agreement with the U.S. is published in Technician Class Text on page 42. As with any service you provide with your amateur station, you are not allowed to accept any money for passing third-party messages. When you send a third-party message, I would do something like WB9NJS KC6MGM. I'm going to give the call sign of both stations at the end of the communications. And if Tim was the person on the other end, he would give KC6MGM WB9NJS out. So you have to give both call signs when you're doing third-party communications between countries. Which of the following restrictions apply when a non-licensed person is allowed to speak to a foreign station using the station under the control of a technician class control operator. The foreign station must be one with which the U.S. has a third-party agreement. What is the definition of third-party communication? A message from a control operator to another amateur station control operator on behalf of another person. One-way communications. There are a few allowable forms of one-way communications. One of these is transmission of bulletins or information pertaining to or of interest to amateur radio. This is different from broadcasts intended for the general public. This is where our swap net falls in. I can get on the radio and I can tell the rest of the people on the radio who are on the swap net of items that are for sale by other people. That's a transmission of a bulletin of interest to amateur radio. Other permitted one-way transmissions include remote control of models, code practice sessions, and propagation beacons. Code practice sessions, you can go on there and you can actually practice Morse code on the radio, sending it one way. Propagation beacons are actually beacons that will tell you how your signal strength is coming in. You go in there and you can basically listen to these stations and see how well they come into your station, and you'll know how well you get out to that distance. Propagation beacons are stationed which transmit communications for the purpose of observation, signal propagation, and reception. Beacon stations allow you to determine if a signal path exists between your station and the region where the beacon is located. Beacon stations are listed to 100 watts PEP for transmitter power. Any licensed amateur, including a technician, can operate a beacon station within their operating privileges. So you could set up a UHF, VHF beacon station. You could set up a 10-meter beacon station that would be on SSB, single sideband. What's the FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? An amateur station transmitting communications for the purposes of observing propagation or related experimental activities. Emergencies. Special rules apply for emergencies. A distress call may be made or answered on any frequency, even those outside your operating privilege. A valid emergency involving a threat to life or property must exist. This is a life and death situation right now. It would be the only situation where a Mayday or SOS call should be used. Under some circumstances, the FCC may make a declaration of a temporary state of emergency. Such a declaration would include any special conditions or rules to be followed during the emergency. When a disaster disrupts normal communications, transmission should be limited to those necessary to meet essential communication needs and to facilitate relief activities. So, you happen to be at my station, it happens to be on a marine frequency, and you hear an SOS. You as a technician can answer that on that frequency. I can answer that on that frequency. My general license doesn't normally cover marine communications, but if this is a valid threat to life or property, it can be answered regardless of your license status. There are a number of amateur radio organizations that are included in the designation of emergency amateur radio services. They include the Amateur Radio Civil Emergency Services, RACES, the Amateur Radio Emergency Services, ARIES, and Auxiliary Communication Services. Amateur radio organizations that work in conjunction with their local, county, or state Office of Emergency Services are classified as emergency amateur radio services. OES, the Office of Emergency Services, is now considered the civil defense agency in the United States. The state has an Office of Emergency Services. Each county has an Office of Emergency Services. Some of the larger cities have Office of Emergency Services. Anyone who's a ham radio operator who works directly with them, if there's an emergency, they are authorized to operate as an emergency ham radio operator. In Mendocino County, the Mendocino Auxiliary Communication Service is the auxiliary communication service for the County Office of Emergency Services, and we are authorized to work and transmit for them as emergency communicators. When may amateur stations transmit information in support of broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? Only where such communications directly relate to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. An example of this is if all the communications goes out, the phones, the internet, cell service go out in the county, the Office of Emergency Services here through MAX will have radio operators at the commercial radio stations so we can send bulletins from the Office of Emergency Services to the radio stations so the radio stations can transmit information related to immediate safety of human life or protection of property. That's the only time we can do it. Which of the following describes the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Services, RACES? A radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communications. A radio service using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications. An emergency service using amateur operators certified by civil defense organizations as being enrolled in that organization. All of these choices are correct. All of the MAX members are designated county disaster service workers, so we are enrolled in a civil defense organization. Space station satellites. A unique aspect of amateur radio is the ability to communicate with space stations. The FCC defines amateur space stations as an amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. This includes the International Space Station and amateur satellites. Any licensed amateur can be the licensee of an amateur space station, regardless of license class. Most amateur satellites receive signals on one frequency band, which is the uplink, and retransmit the signal on another band, which is the downlink. VHF and UH bands are frequently used for amateur satellites, making them available for technician class licensees. One technician band that is unavailable for satellite operation is 6 meters. Now, this basically means, yes, you can talk to the International Space Station. I would highly recommend not doing that. They are very busy up there, and normally all of their transmissions are to schools to help the school kids understand what's going on up in space. But you can sure listen to them. And if you happen to have the money, you can actually make your own satellite and find somebody to launch it into space, and you will have your own space station. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? An amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. What is the only time an amateur station is authorized to transmit music using phone admission? When incidental to an authorized transmission of manned spacecraft communication. This is a very, very, very special rule. What this basically means is NASA can send music to the International Space Station. And they do that by amateur radio. They had to add this specifically in there so that NASA could do that. So NASA can send transmission to the International Space Station over ham radio. Other than that, don't transmit music on your ham radio. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to hide their meaning? Only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio-controlled craft. The reason that they have this is they don't want people to send encoded messages over the ham radio. But you can do that to control your space station or your satellite so that other people can't give it a control to make it crash to the earth or go spinning out in space. Who may the control operator of the station communicating through an amateur satellite or space station? Any amateur whose license privileges allow them to transmit on the satellite uplink frequency. So if there are other space stations up there, you are allowed, as long as they're a UHF VHF station, to transmit to them with a technician license. Which amateurs may contact the International Space Station, ISS, on VHF bands. Any amateur holding a technician or higher class license. Like I said, I would highly recommend not trying to contact the International Space Station. Interference. Just as there is congestion on some highways, some amateur bands become crowded. If two amateurs wish to use the same frequency, most stations have equal rights to the frequency. There's no special privilege for a higher class license. I can't tell you, hey, you're only a technician, I'm a general, give me the frequency. Doesn't work that way. Some amateur bands are actually shared with other services. In that case, the FCC will designate a primary and secondary user. There are some places in the United States that you can't use certain frequencies because they're close to military bases or NASA installations and so on. When amateurs are designated the secondary user, their operation must not cause interference to the primary users. So you're driving past Fort Huachuca, Arizona, which happens to be the intelligence center for the military, and you're on a frequency and the military comes on and you can't interfere with them. You have to get off that frequency. When is it willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted? Never. You cannot interfere with another amateur radio station at any time. Are U.S. amateurs restricted in segments of the band where amateur radio service is secondary? U.S. amateurs may find non-amateur stations in those portions and must avoid interfering with them. Okay, that pretty much covers the whole class. There'll be 6 questions in the test on rules and regulations. Most of the FCC rules and regulations are common sense. If you follow the rules, it will assist you in contact with other hams.
So testing. Test session this Saturday will take place in Fort Bragg. The following Saturday, April 15th, in Ukiah. What we did for the most part was the information that you provided when you registered is what we're going to just roll into the test registration database. One thing that you will need in order to take the exam is a federal registration number, an FRN. Now, you may already have one, even if you don't hold a ham license. If you have another federally issued license, say a pilot's license, you're already in the system and you would use the same FRN. So I'm not sure what other federal licensees are there, but I know for sure pilot, drone pilots, and I'm sure several others. So you may already have one if you hold another federal license. If you don't, you will need to get an FRN. And the big long URL at the top is the step-by-step information for obtaining an FRN through the FCC. If you Google, how do I get an FRN, one of the results will be this link and you can follow that. Or you can try to write it down. I'll leave it on the screen a while. It's really not that hard. You can just go to the main page and That's a much simpler URL, apps.fcc.gov/CORES CORES. If you get there, in about center of the screen, it'll say need a username. Register is a choice below that, and you can follow there. But if you had an FRN when you registered and you included that registered for the class and included that information, that'll just roll right in. If you didn't have one and have since obtained one, we would like to get that before your test date. Let me give you the contact information there. The Fort Bragg session, which is this Saturday at the Fort Bragg Senior Center, Saturday, April 8th. Ken Wallach is the contact over there. I passed along all of the registration information I had for people who had indicated they wanted to take the test in Fort Bragg or who had a Fort Bragg mailing address. And Ken's going to make sure he gets in contact with all of those people. So if you signed up for Fort Bragg, you should hear from Ken. If you signed up for Ukiah, you'll hear from me, Tim Hanna, and you can contact me there at tdhanna@msn.com if you need more information. I have roughly 10 people signed up for Ukiah, roughly 10 for Fort Bragg, and roughly 10 who did not indicate. So if you haven't didn't sign up for a test session when you registered for the class and you do want to test, you need to let me know or Ken know so he's prepared on Saturday. In my case, for the Ukiah session, I print out all of the documents the day before, so you're not sitting there filling out paperwork. That speeds things along and it ensures legible information going in for the licensing. So that's why we require pre-registration and that you obtain the FRN. Like I said, I will be anybody who signed up for. If you haven't signed up, and want to test, make sure that you do. If you obtain an FRN since you enrolled, you can pass that along either to Ken or myself, depending on where you plan to test. And when you do test, the day of the test, bring a photo ID with you, a government issued ID preferably, or a driver's license or state ID card or a passport, something like that. We need to know that you are who you say you are. You'll also need to be bringing $15 cash for the testing fee. That's the fee charged to take the examination. And one of the things that's changed in the rules, Mike had mentioned that once the license appears in the FCC database, you're good to go. The FCC has recently begun charging $35 to issue the license. So once that shows up that you're there, you have to make arrangements to pay online the fee for the 10-year license. I'm not happy about this. I'm an old timer and never had to pay for a license before, but that doesn't really matter. That's what it is. But $15 at the day of testing to cover the testing fee. Once you pass and a license is pending by the FCC, you'll have to make arrangements to give them the $35. Location of testing in Ukiah. It will be at Redwood Academy on State Street. That should be North State, I think. Right there by the fairgrounds. As you pull into the fairgrounds there, if you make a quick left, there's a cluster of classroom buildings and parking. The people who are taking the exam, we ask that you show up at 9:30 to complete the registration. We'll try to get the testing underway by 10. That's why having the information ahead of time to make sure we have all the information ready to go. again, I'll be sending emails to anybody who registered for Ukiah or did not specify. Ken will be sending emails to anybody who registered for Fort Bragg or lives in Fort Bragg, and that will be going to the email address that you used when you registered. If you don't receive an email from Ken or myself within the next day or so, then use the emails that I provided on the screen. Mine TD Hannah at MSN, and I don't remember Ken's off the top of my head, but yeah, either way, an email should be going out to the email that you used when you registered. If you don't see something soon, then maybe there's a problem. Well, I'll just say one thing. This has been enjoyable. I always like the opportunity to help people get into this hobby. It's a great hobby with lots and lots and lots of benefits. There's interest for everyone. And whether it's emergency communications or bouncing signals off satellites or just talking to your friends down the street, the opportunities are nearly endless. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope as many of you they can get a license, get active, get on the air, and have fun with it.
I'd like to mention one thing about ham radio. It has come in very handy. I have a mobile radio. I've had two times where I have had warnings when I was driving down the highway going from Laytonville to Ukiah that there was an accident on Ridgewood Grade. And as a result, I got a chance to turn around as opposed to sitting in traffic for an hour, not going anywhere. I've had two times, once on a traffic accident and once on a fire, where I picked up the ham radio, called another ham radio operator, just put out a CQ call to let them know, hey, notify the highway patrol there's an accident here and there's nobody available. And one time, actually driving into Ukiah, as I was driving down Ridgewood Grade, there were 3 fires on the side of the road and there were no fire trucks. And I put out a call, and by the time I got down to the bottom of Ridgewood Grade, the fire trucks were heading up. So it comes in very handy for emergency situations, other than just chatting with each other and finding out what's going on here, what's going on there. Hey, is it raining there? Is it snowing there? How are you doing? So on. So it's a great form of communications, especially when all the cell phone towers and all the landlines up here in Laytonville, when we had the snowstorm before last, I lost phone for 14 days. The only way I could call anybody was on the ham radio. I'm in a cell phone dead area anyway, but my landline went down. So it comes in real handy for a lot of things other than just chatting back and forth. One of the things you're going to find out, there's 2 things you have to fight. One is called mic fright. People are afraid to pick this thing up and talk into it. No matter what you do, you're probably not going to do anything wrong. The people are going to jump down your throat. We're a friendly group of people. We like to talk to each other. We don't get to talk to each other enough. So don't be afraid to pick up the radio and put out a call. And the second thing is, if you have a handheld radio, Baofeng, I happen to have a Yaesu, that's 5 watts. Don't be discouraged if you can't talk to somebody really far away. If you're in a good location for a repeater, it doesn't matter. If you're in the Ukiah Valley, you're going to be able to hit the repeater up on Laughlin Mountain. If you're in Laytonville, you're probably going to be able to hit the repeater in Caddo. They connect to everybody else. If you can talk to one repeater, you're going to talk to everybody. Everybody's going to talk to you. But if you have one of these and you're sort of a dead spot, you're going to have trouble talking to people. If you're using a base station radio or a mobile radio, you're putting out 50 watts. You're putting out 10 times the power. So you can talk to more people. And one of the key things is this antenna. You can have a radio and a dynamite antenna, and you'll talk to everybody. You can have a dynamite radio and an antenna, you won't talk to anyone. The antenna is the key to really talking to people. I switched the antenna on this one, and it changed it unbelievably as far as who I can talk to. I couldn't talk to the cattle repeater from Laytonville on the original that came on here. I put on a different one, I was fine. So there's a lot of things to look at, and you have probably emails from Tim and myself and Mike and that. If you have a question, ask us. We'll be happy to help. I've helped set up radios in Laytonville. I set program radios here the program radios in Laytonville and also in Covelo to help people so they can get on the air. The more the merrier.